Thank you for joining me on YouTube Live on Saturday morning. It's 9:30 a.m. on January 29th, 2022. Today we're going to talk about CE marking. What is a CE mark for medical devices and how do you apply for certification? This is a question that I get from companies that have never done this before. It might even be new to medical devices. And it's becoming more and more common now that we have more companies that are from the software industry that are trying to break into the medical device industry with software they've developed, because it's much easier to develop software that works than it is to actually get it through a regulatory process and start selling a medical device. So the CE mark specifically is for European Union sales. You need a CE mark on your product in order to sell a medical device in Europe. And the European Union has two new regulations for medical devices. The first one is medical devices and active implantable medical devices. And then the second one is for IVD products, so in vitro diagnostic medical devices. Those two different regulations have different implementation times. The medical device regulation took effect in Europe last year, May 26, 2021. And the IVD regulation, IVDR, that's going into effect May 26, 2022, so in just a few months. The new regulations require a process that's similar to the old process that's been around since the 90s. The fundamental differences between the old process and the current process is that they've increased the requirements for post-market surveillance. That's number one. Number two, they've made it tougher regarding the clinical study requirements to demonstrate efficacy and performance of your product. And last but not least, they've dramatically made it tougher for notified bodies to qualify as a notified body and be designated under the new regulations. In fact, when I first got into CE marking of medical devices back in early 2000s, there were about 70 of them, 72, I think. It peaked at about 80 something. Then it was down to 40. Now we're down to, I think, in the low 20s in terms of the number of notified bodies that are designated. And it's even a smaller number that can handle IVD products. So if you want to CE mark your product to sell in the European Union, the first thing you need to do is figure out what the regulatory pathway is for your product. And that involves figuring out what is the classification of your device. They have four different classifications, Class 1, Class 2A, Class 2B, and Class 3. However, within the Class 1 devices, they also have some sub-classifications. If your device is a Class 1 device that requires surgical reuse or is indicated for surgical reuse, such as a scalpel, that reusable instrument has a different level of risk than a device that's disposable. So therefore, those Class 1R devices, they don't actually say Class 1R, they just say Class 1 devices that are reusable surgically. Those devices will be requiring a notified body as well. There's also Class 1S. These are Class 1 devices that are sterile. And then the last one is Class 1M. These are Class 1 devices that have a measurement function. So if your device is for surgical use and reusable, if your device is Class 1 and sterile or Class 1 and measuring, all three of those require notified bodies to review your technical documentation and grant you the CE certificate. And they would look just at those aspects: reuse, cleaning, disinfection of the device, sterilization of the device, and the measurement function to make sure it's accurate. If your device is a Class 2A, Class 2B, or Class 3 devices, those are higher risk devices, you also will require a notified body. And as you go up in classification towards the 3, it becomes tougher and tougher, and you have more stringent requirements and tougher review by each of the notified bodies. For the devices that are Class 1, the lowest risk, and don't have the R, S, or M subclassification, those devices are eligible for self-declaration. What self-declaration means is you don't need a notified body to help you with the CE marking process. But you do need a quality system, And you still need to create a declaration of conformity that indicates that you're self-declaring you comply with all the regulations that are applicable to your device. And last but not least, you have to create and maintain a technical file. In the past, Class 1 devices that were exempt from notified body involvement and they could self-declare, a lot of these companies didn't do what they were supposed to do. They would create a declaration of conformity, they would label their device properly, but they wouldn't create a technical file that met all the requirements. Well, now what's going on is they put into the regulations that other economic operators that are also responsible for reviewing and making sure that you're doing your job, those companies have to verify that you're maintaining the technical file. So the economic operators include a notified body if you have one. They're not technically one of the economic operators, but they would have to verify that you're maintaining one. The other economic operators that they're specifically looking for, as you're an economic operator and your responsibility is to make sure the company has this. One of them is the authorized representative. So if you're located outside of the European Union and you're selling into the European Union, you need an authorized representative whose name and address is on your labeling as the identified contact. If there are any quality issues or complaints or adverse events with the product, you can report it to them. So you have a local contact in the European Union you can contact instead of contacting the company who's outside of the EU. Also, in order for jurisdiction reasons, the European Union competent authorities need a local contact that they can contact in case there are any problems. The next economic operator would be an importer. So whoever is making sure that your product is imported into the European Union, they also have to have their identification on your label so they can add a sticker when they import the product, or you can add it for them. But you have to identify who the importer of the product is. Another designation would be the distributor of your product. The importer could also be the distributor. In theory, the importer and distributor could be the same person, but they could also be your authorized representative. It's not necessarily recommended because not all distributors/importers are as highly trained as an authorized representative, and there are a lot of burdens on that. But if you had one that took on that duty, they would have to perform all the functions of an authorized representative, all the functions of an importer, and all the functions of a distributor. And the authorized representatives and the importers have to be registered in the new Eudamed database. It's an electronic database just like the FDA's database. You have the FDA registration listing database. Eudamed has that function. We have a MAUD database where we put serious incidents and deaths. Same thing for Eudamed. You also would have a part of the database that has all your CE certificates and company contacts. That's similar to our registration database, but it also would have the certificates. So there's a lot of information that will be in this brand new Eudamed database, but it's only partially implemented at this point. The Eudamed database will also have the UDI barcodes. These are the barcodes that we put on products. We have that in the US. We call it a GUDID database. So a lot of the same databases that you see now for the FDA, you're going to see those as part of the Eudamed database in Europe, but it's going to be a slightly different system. And once they have all of those implemented, then everybody will have to comply with the Eudamed requirements. For right now, it's voluntary, but don't wait until the end because there'll be quite a long wait to get into the system and enter all your data. So do it now while it's voluntary. Don't wait till it's mandatory. I think I've covered all the key things except the technical file details, the certification process, and the labeling. So I'm going to cover the labeling first. Labeling requirements, you know what a product is CE marked if it has a C and an E on it, and it's a special character style that has to be there. They actually show you in the regulation what that must look like in the ratio of each letter, the height, and the height of it must be a minimum of 5 millimeters in height. It needs to be bold, it's black. And then if you have a notified body involved, you would have a 4-digit number that's equal bold and font to the C and the E, either below it or next to it. If it's regardless of whether it's below it or next to it, typically the font size must be at least a minimum of 2.5 millimeters in order to be the same boldness and font, because the C and the E, which are capital letters, those would be 5 millimeters in height. Can you have bigger than 5 millimeters? Sure. Can you have bigger than the 2.5? But they should be the same ratio. You don't want to hide the little 4-digit number. So half the height of your C and the E, that's how high those numbers should be. But it's a 4-digit number, and you're not allowed to use those 4-digit numbers unless you have a CE certificate from your notified body. So that's how you know that a product is CE marked. And that CE symbol would appear on the product, on the labeling, on your instructions for use. You can also put it on your website, but you need to do it in a way so it's very clear that the product is CE marked, not your whole company is CE marked. They don't CE mark companies. The next thing we're going to cover is the certification process. For the certification process, you have a quality system certification, and then you have your product certification. The quality system certification, they're looking for, do you have a quality system? And most companies will comply with ISO 1345. And there are certain things in ISO 1345-2016 that don't match up with 100% of the requirements in the European regulations. So if you want to know what those differences are, there's a European version, EN ISO 1345-2016, and it's a 2021 amendment. And that amendment, and you can buy just the amendment, it will tell you what the gaps are between the ISO 1345 standard and what's specifically required for CE marking. And there are some differences. The technical documentation is a lot of it, risk management files, post-market surveillance, things like that. But if you want to make sure that your company is compliant with the quality system part, you can't just say, oh, I have ISO 1345. There are some additional requirements, such as vigilance procedure, a recall procedure that specifically tells you how to recall a product in the European Union according to those regulations. You need a document that explains the communication process between your company and notified bodies and your company and economic operators, and covers the registration process for the economic operators. There are also some other requirements in that quality system part, such as how to maintain a technical file. But if your company is going to be self-declaring, what some companies will do is they will go out and get ISO 1345 certification, and then they rely on their own internal auditing to make sure they've met all the other quality system requirements. And in those cases, they might have an ISO 1345 certificate from a certification body that is not a notified body, so they're not designated under the regulations. That's okay for class 1 devices that don't involve a notified body. An example of one would be Eagle Certification Group. Another one would be Perry, and I can't remember the last name of the company. But there are certification bodies out there that do ISO 1345 certification, but they aren't notified bodies, so they can't give you a CE certificate. But you can identify that certificate that you have in your self-declaration or declaration of conformity. If your product is a higher risk, the 1R, the 1S, the 1M, 2A, 2B, or 3, then you have to have a notified body that's issuing that full quality system certificate. They don't have to make it to 1345, so you could have a 1345 certificate and then a quality system certificate from a notified body. But most companies opt for getting just the notified body will also give me a 1345 certificate. So that is how most companies will do this. And then last but not least, you have the product certification. So the product certification, they're going to review your technical documentation for the 1M, the 1S, the 1R, or 2AB, or 3, and they're going to make sure it meets all the requirements, and then they're going to issue a certificate for that product or product family. So you may have multiple certificates if there are multiple classifications and multiple scopes. Particularly for some of the class 3 devices, they might issue a specific certificate for that device. So that's the certification process. You apply for it. Just like the ISO 1345, you have a stage 1 audit, you have a stage 2 audit. The stage 1 audit is typically a day or a day and a half to make sure you're ready for the stage 2. And then maybe a month and a half later, you'll be scheduled for the stage 2 audit, which might be a whole week long. And during that audit, they will review your technical file and they'll review your quality system. They'll review all your records. And some notified bodies, they'll review the technical documentation remotely. But other notified bodies, they'll do it all on site, all at one time. Some notified bodies will use multiple types of auditors, some that just do quality systems, some that just do technical documentation, some that do microbiology audits. So depending on the notified body, they may have slightly different ways of doing the stage 2 audits. And then after you obtain certification, then you have to maintain that. So they do annual surveillance audits to make sure you're maintaining the system. And then once every 3 years, they recertify you. For the CE product certificate, those are updated every 5 years. And then different notified bodies will have different schedules for reviewing things like microbiology as well. So that might be every 2 years. So it depends on what notified body you have chosen, what the classification of the device is, and how many devices you have. But that certification process is quite lengthy. They'll typically be charging you over $3,000 a day for an auditor. And if you add that up, if you have a day and a half for the stage 1 and another 5 days for the other, you can count on this as going to be tens of thousands of dollars by the time you're through getting your CE certificates. In addition to that, the notified bodies, if it's a class 1R, S, or M, or 2A, B, or 3, those devices require a review of your technical file. Now, your technical file, if you have a class 1 device or any of the other classifications, your economic operators, the authorized representatives, the importers, and the distributors are responsible for verifying that you're maintaining these technical files. That does not necessarily mean that they are required to do a full technical file review like a notified body would, but some of the authorized representatives have figured out this is a great way to make some money. So you might want to be careful about which authorized representative you pick. It shouldn't be necessary for them to do a full-blown technical file review, just like a notified body is, to make sure that you're compliant. They should be able to verify compliance by spot checking specific documents that are important. And those typical ones would be, do you have a valid ISO 1345 certificate? Do you have the additional procedures that are not covered under ISO 1345, such as vigilance, technical file reporting, communication with economic operators? In addition to that, they would be verifying that you have a declaration of conformity for your product. They would be verifying that you have a technical file. But one of the ways of providing the technical file is as an index. So it's basically a table of contents. So if you show them, oh, here's my table of contents, my index for the technical file, now they can see all the content that's in there, and they can see revision dates. They can see what revisions you've made over time. They can see you're maintaining it. And they might even ask to sample a few documents, like maybe your instructions for use. That would be a common document for them to look at. They might check if they're a distributor that you have the translations in their language and verify the accuracy of those translations, which is another one of those responsibilities that the economic operators have. Specifically, distributors will have that requirement. So those are all the things that they're going to be looking for in the technical documentation. But now we get into what is in the technical documentation. You have basically 4 annexes that are applicable here. The first one, Annex I, is the General Safety and Performance Requirements, or GSPRs. There are 23 of them, and they have subsections. So Section 23, that has subsection 1, subsection 2, subsection 3, and subsection 4. And I believe subsection 4 has over 26 different subsections. So it goes up to AA, AB, AC. Yeah, ridiculously long list. And that last one that I happen to pick, that's specific to the instruction for use content, what content and format should be in your instruction for use. So you have to show some way how you're meeting all the requirements of the GSPRs in your technical file. And the most common way to do that is to create a GSPR checklist. We used to call it an essential requirements checklist because Annex I was called the essential requirements. It's been renamed the General Safety and Performance Requirements, GSPRs. So you should have a GSPR checklist. And if you haven't updated your essential requirements checklist from the MDD, it would no longer match because we have a different list and a different number of requirements. But we still use a checklist. And in that checklist, you would identify, is this requirement applicable to my device? If it's not, you wouldn't just say NA, you would say NA, and then explain why with a short justification. Like, well, this electrical safety requirement isn't applicable because my device isn't powered. Like, for instance, a catheter wouldn't typically be powered. So after you've filled in all of Annex I's checklist requirements, the next requirement would be Annex II. This is telling you step by step what should be in your technical file or technical file index. So all the documents that you need to include. And you'll find it's very similar to the requirements that would be in a 510K submission or in a Canadian license submission. The third requirement is a new requirement. It's all new, the post-market surveillance section of your technical file. So they didn't have this requirement before. This is one of the areas that's a hot button for all the auditors. They're looking for your company maintaining a post-market surveillance section of your technical file that will have the post-market surveillance plan. It will have post-market surveillance reports, PSURs, post-market clinical follow-up plans, or a justification why you don't need post-market clinical follow-up. So all that documentation has got to be in there. And then the last section, Annex IV, this would be the Declaration of Conformity. That's where you find all the requirements for what should be in your Declaration of Conformity. One of the toughest areas of all is buried as one of the line items in Annex II. That's the clinical evaluation report. Companies can meet the clinical evaluation report by either providing a literature review, which is getting harder and harder to do. Number two, you can provide a clinical study. So this would be a pre-market clinical study that you would do before you submit for CE marking. And you would present that summary report to the notified body, and they would review that and approve that it meets all the requirements. And then the third possibility is a mixture of the two with a literature review and some actual preclinical studies. You could also be doing post-market studies in another market where you do have regulatory approval and use that data for your CE marking submission. So there's 3 different ways that you can build that clinical evaluation report, but that clinical evaluation report has to be maintained and updated on a regular basis. And the higher the risk device, the more frequently they expect you to update that. So you're going to find that it's gotten so tough to create those documents that it will cost you almost as much money to do that as all the testing that you had to do for your benchtop testing and electrical safety and EMC and things like that. But it's something that you have to maintain over time. So you have to continue to spend this money to maintain your clinical evaluation report. There, of course, is also a risk management file that's included as one of the line items in your technical file for Annex II. So you're going to find in Annex I, II, III, and IV, there are a lot of requirements, and it takes a long time to create that technical file, longer than it would to create a 510K or Canadian license submission. And the cost of the review is also more expensive because the notified bodies are charging that $3,000 plus per day to review your technical file. And then they give you a list of deficiencies, and you come back to them with responses to those deficiencies. And by the time they're done, it could easily take 9 to 12 months to get your CE mark. For the lower risk devices, it might take less time, but right now the length of that review is driven primarily by the amount of backlog that each of those notified bodies have trying to update people's existing certificates and renewing certificates that companies have, as well as issuing new MDR certificates. So those notified bodies are really stretched thin at this time, and you will find a backlog and find some very long timelines for their quotes. So I think I've covered just about everything that's involved in the CE marking process. So now you know if you see that CE symbol with a 4-digit number, that involved a notified body. If you see the CE without the 4-digit number, it doesn't involve a notified body. You know that there are multiple classifications. You know, sometimes you need a notified body, sometimes you don't. You know where you can find some of the requirements for technical documentation. You know that you need quality system certification, and you know that this is going to be a maintenance task that you have to keep up over time. In the past, companies used to say, well, CE markings, that's the easiest way. I'm going to get to market first with that. That might have been true about 15 years ago, but that's no longer true. Now the CE marking process is the most difficult regulatory process in the entire world by country. So if you take the same product and you try to get it approved in any other country and get it approved in Europe, Europe will be the toughest. And they've done that on purpose. They wanted to restore the public's trust in the regulatory process after a few very public scandals, one related to a breast implant that was made out of industrial silicone and killed some women. And when we say some, there were hundreds of thousands of women that had these implants that weren't safe. And some of them just got sick and some of them actually died. So that was a very big case. And the owner of the company ended up in jail, and the company went out of business. So there was nobody to pay for this mess that they created. So that's part of a lot out of the regulation changes that they made. Another scandal that occurred around the same time was metal-on-metal hip implants. These were titanium implants that had two metal components that would rub against each other instead of the ball part being having a shell that would be made out of plastic that would wear instead. And when you have metal on metal wearing against each other, you have wear debris, and the wear debris was causing a lot of health problems for people. So if you had two pieces of metal touching each other, that's one thing. But when they wear against each other inside the body, you get the wear debris, and that's what was causing the problem. And because each implant's going to have different amounts of wear, it wasn't consistent. So they would see, oh, this is performing great in the short term with the best case patients. But when you start looking at the worst case patients and you look at long term, you see some of those problems. And that's why we have the post-market surveillance requirements now. And we have post-market clinical follow-up requirements that are extremely tough, especially for implants. So I think I've covered all the basics of CE marking. There's a lot of material to cover. You might want to watch this more than once. It's only a half-hour video, but it's really important to understand what you're getting into. It's not, oh, I think I want CE marking too. Can you go get that for me? It's, oh, I want CE marking, and so for the next year, I'm going to be working on this, and I'm going to spend tens of thousands of dollars. It could be as much as $100,000 for a company to get CE marked, to get through the whole entire process. And it's not the same for every product class, so you need to get a quote, and every notified body is different. Every authorized representative is different. You're going to have to be wise about selection of the notified body and authorized reps, and qualify them and say, okay, yes, this is who I want to work with. This will work well for our company. Don't jump into this blindly. Do your homework and plan accordingly, and you need a budget to match. I hope that was helpful for those people that wanted to understand the CE marking process, and probably dispelled a lot of the myths that were going around about, I heard this. Get it from the source of somebody that's actually done this. I've been doing this since 2003, working on CE marking products. And I actually worked for a notified body for 3.5 years, from 2009 to 2012, just as they were starting to bring in these new regulations. I hope that was helpful to everybody. And if you have any suggestions for new topics, please click on the link below for our suggestion box. And I'll put some other links for on the box below, explaining where you can find additional information on our website. Thank you, and hope you have a great day. Bye-bye.